Chapter 1. The Vicar's Wife Spills the Tea. The annual summer fete in St. Cramwell was the sort of tradition that had no beginning and no conceivable end. It simply was like the ancient yew tree outside the churchyard, or the way Mrs. Crawley always won second prize in the Victoria Sponge category and looked more aggrieved than if she had come in last. On this particular July morning the fete was in full swing, and the weather, too perfect to last, clung with an uneasy stillness. To the hedgerows and tents Miss Marple arrived shortly after 10, walking slowly but steadily up the path to the vicarage garden. She wore her customary straw hat with the faded pink ribbon and carried her parasol, though the sun had not yet grown aggressive. Her shoes, sensible brown lace ups, tapped a gentle rhythm on the flagstones. She had already paused twice once to note the curious angle of a red bicycle left by the bakery gate, and once more to remark on the absence of crows in the elms near the post office. But such observations, while seemingly idle, were never without weight in Miss Marple's mind. She had always believed the world whispered before it shouted inside the garden. Bunting fluttered in crisp diagonals, and card tables buckled under trifles, seed cakes, and a baffling array of hand-labeled jams. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Arbuthnot, stood beside the tea-urn with a practised smile, holding court among the more senior ladies of the village. Her voice, while perfectly pleasant, had a sharp undertow to it like velvet hiding a thorn. "There you are, Miss Marple," she said, handing over a cup of tea, "and not a moment too soon. I feared you might be hiding away in that little sitting-room of yours, buried under cross-stitch and murder mysteries." "I save those for the evenings," said Miss Marple with a smile. "One must ration one's pleasures." Mrs. Arbuthnot tittered, though she hadn't quite understood the joke. Her attention drifted over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Speaking of mysterious things," she said, voice lowering to a near-conspiratorial hush, "have you met our new arrival, Miss Braithwaite?" Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Only in passing." "Well, she's very clever, I suppose," Mrs. Arbuthnot went on, pouring herself a second cup she wouldn't drink. "Always writing little poems in her notebook and saying things like language is a mirror. Personally, I've always preferred a mirror to be a mirror and language to be polite." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And what does she look like, this poetess?" "Oh, quite attractive in a slippery way. That shade of lipstick young women wear when they wish to be noticed, but pretend they don't. And she's forever touching people's arms when she speaks. Henry Dodd seems utterly taken with her. Poor man. Mind you, he's been a bachelor far too long. His head's bound to be turned by anyone who quotes Tennyson at him." Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea, her gaze drifting across the lawn. She saw Fenella Braithwaite at once, though the young woman wasn't doing anything overtly attention-seeking. No, she was simply standing by the embroidery stall with Henry Dodd, her body angled just so, her smile lazy and tilted, like a cat, sunning itself. Her dark hair was pinned back with a tortoise-shell comb, and she wore a dress the exact color of new leaves. Fresh, calculated. "She has long fingers," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Arbuthnot blinked. "Do you think so? I hadn't noticed." "No, most people wouldn't." From behind the cake tent someone shouted, "Who took the last slice of Battenberg?" and laughter followed. A child tripped over a garden hose and wailed. The brass band, oblivious, launched into a rendition of Abide With Me that was just slow enough to be menacing. "Isn't she entering the calligraphy competition?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "She is." "Though I don't see why," Mrs. Arbuthnot said with a sniff. "The whole idea was meant for the school children and a few of the mothers. But she showed up at the last committee meeting and simply inserted herself, brought her own ink to some rather exotic blend she said she imported from France, said it was infused with elderflower or eucalyptus or some such nonsense." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did she say where she lived before coming to St. Cramwell?" "Only vaguely. A bit of everywhere," was how she put it, which usually means nowhere at all, doesn't it? "I've never trusted anyone who doesn't know where their grandmother was buried." Miss Marple didn't respond to that. She was watching the poetry tent, now a small, canvas-covered corner beside the bookstall. There someone had just run out, breathless and anxious-looking, a young man with ink on his fingers and panic on his face. He disappeared toward the vicarage. Moments later, a murmur began to travel through the crowd, moving from mouth to ear like a cold breeze through a warm room. "Something's happened in the tent," came the whispers. "Somebody's ruined the entries. Ink everywhere, like it bled straight through the paper." Reverend Arbuthnot himself appeared shortly after, his expression flustered and apologetic. He mounted the tiny wooden platform meant for announcing raffle winners and cleared his throat. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," he began, "but there's been a small incident in the calligraphy area. It appears someone has spilled ink across several entries, including Miss Braithwaite's rather beautiful submission." "The ink?" "Well, we can't seem to remove it." A low ripple of commentary swept the fete. "Does ink usually do that?" someone asked. "Stain like that? Maybe it's that French stuff she brought." Another said Henry Dodd was at the front now, speaking rapidly to the vicar. Miss Braithwaite was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple watched it all, quiet as a pew mouse. She tilted her head as the vicar described the strange qualities of the ink, its stubbornness, its bitterness, its unwillingness to fade. She had once known a girl who'd tried to poison herself with ink. Not for attention, not for love, simply because she had mistaken it for something else. The girl had lived. But her fingernails remained stained forever. As the sun climbed higher and shadows shortened, the fate began to unravel. A sense of unease settled in like mist from the moors. The children no longer squealed. The brass band missed a beat, and the poetry tent stood silent and spoiled. Then, just before noon, a cry cut through the air. It came from the back of the church, sharp, breathless, not hysterical, but real. One of the altar boys running from the vestry, pale and shaking. People rushed forward, but Miss Marple did not move. She already knew what had happened, though she could not yet say how or why. She had seen it in the long fingers, in the imported ink, in the way the girl had smiled without blinking. Fenella Braithwaite had been found dead, her head resting on a blotter soaked through with the same stubborn, impossible ink, and the fate, once bright with jam and bunting, was now just another place where someone had died. Chapter 2. The village reacts by the following morning. The bunting had been quietly taken down. The fate tables had been folded and returned to the parish hall's basement, and only a few stubborn cupcake wrappers stirred in the breeze outside the vicarage garden. Yet despite the vicar's best efforts to keep things respectfully subdued, as he put it, no force on earth, not even ecclesiastical decorum, could stop the thrum of gossip now pulsing through St. Cramwell like fever through a closed-room. Miss Marple, seated by her front window with a modest saucer of stewed plums, watched as one villager after another passed by her garden gate. Some slowed, pretending to admire the nasturtiums. Others glanced toward her windows in hopes of catching her eye, perhaps to be invited in under the guise of condolence, but really for the purpose of speculation. She saw them all, and in her quiet way she noted which faces looked curious, which looked strained, and which avoided the gate entirely. Death always left behind a silence, but in a village like St. Cramwell, the silence was merely a pause. Before the chorus at 11, as expected, Mrs. Mapleton from the bakery arrived bearing a rather dry apple tart, and a hunger not at all related to pastry. Miss Marple welcomed her with warm politeness and 2 cups of strong tea. "Dreadful thing," said Mrs. Mapleton at once, taking a seat without waiting to be offered one. "Just dreadful. And so young, too. They say her eyes were still open when they found her. Imagine." "I prefer not to," Miss Marple replied softly. Mrs. Mapleton looked slightly chastised, but only slightly. "Of course, yes, I quite agree. But one does wonder, doesn't one? I mean, she was just there, smiling, helping with the poetry display, laughing with Henry Dodd, and then the next moment dead in the vestry like something out of one of those detective serials. She must have left the fete just before." "The entries were ruined," Miss Marple said, pouring tea, "or else directly after." "They say the ink was all over her fingers," Mrs. Mapleton continued, leaning forward with the eagerness of someone who had already told the story twice that morning, and the blotter too. "Whatever she was doing in there, it had something to do with that ink. Reverend Arbuthnot said the paper looked almost burnt around the edges. Can you believe it? Burning from ink? That's rather unusual," Miss Marple murmured. "Well, it was French. You know how these foreign things are." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her thoughts were elsewhere. It was odd, yes, but not simply because the ink had stained. What troubled her was why Fenella had gone to the vestry in the first place. It wasn't used for the fete. It wasn't near the poetry tent. And it wasn't a place one simply wandered into by accident. Henry Dodd must be terribly shocked, Miss Marple offered, gently shifting the conversation. "Oh, quite beside himself." Mrs. Mapleton nodded. "I saw him this morning, poor dear. Said he'd only just walked Miss Braithwaite over to the tea stall when she'd excused herself for a moment. Said she seemed distracted, a little, I don't know, distant. Said she mentioned needing to make something right. Very cryptic, don't you think?" "Very," said Miss Marple, her voice mild. "She was always saying things like that, though," Mrs. Mapleton continued, nibbling at the crust of the tart with little interest. "Quite the dramatic type, and not very forthcoming either. I asked her once where she'd learned calligraphy like that, and she just smiled and said, 'From the wrong people at the right time.' I mean, what does that even mean?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She was thinking of a remark Fenella had made weeks earlier at a book club meeting when someone had mentioned the nature of secrets. "Ink is just memory in liquid form," she'd said then, almost dreamily. "Number. One had known quite what to make of it at the time. Now it didn't sound poetic. It sounded like a message. By the time Mrs. Mapleton left, leaving the apple tart behind, of course Miss Marple had mentally filed away at least 6 threads of rumor. That Fenella had fainted before she died, untrue. That the vicar had seen her arguing with someone behind the sacristy, unlikely. That she was secretly married to a lord in Dorset, pure nonsense. And that the ink was poisonous, possibly, but no one had said so officially. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in the village had thickened like overcooked pudding. The police had cordoned off the vestry, though St. Cramwell had no local inspector of its own. An officer from Brixford had been sent in, along with a quiet, heavy-set man in a brown mackintosh named Inspector Barlow. He had polite manners and a neat mustache, and his first action had been to interview the Reverend and his wife. His second, predictably, was to focus on Henry Dodd. Henry, poor soul, had grown pale and soft around the eyes. Miss Marple passed him by the greengrocer's in the late afternoon and noted that he looked 10 years older than the day before. He smiled at her, hesitant, bruised by something he couldn't quite say aloud. "Terrible business," he said, barely above a whisper. "Yes, Henry," she said kindly. "You liked her very much." "I did." He looked at his shoes. "But I didn't know her, Miss Marple, not really. She had shadows in her. I always thought it was just depth. But I'm not so sure now." Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "People often think a shadow makes someone mysterious. Sometimes it simply means they're hiding something." Henry nodded slowly. "They asked me if I'd ever been inside the vestry with her. I hadn't. They asked if she'd mentioned anyone following her or threatening her. She hadn't. She just seemed to drift, you know." "Yes," said Miss Marple, watching the breeze lift a torn Fate poster from the lamppost nearby. "Drifting leaves don't fall on their own. Wind always starts somewhere." As evening settled over the village, lights flicked on one by one, and curtains were drawn like secrets being folded away. But Miss Marple, alone in her sitting room, sat quietly with her knitting untouched in her lap. She could feel it now, the shape of something hiding just behind the fabric of this death. It wasn't the ink. It wasn't the poem. It wasn't even the VESTRY. It was the thing Fenella had come to fix, and someone had made sure she never would. Chapter 3. Whispers over fresh laundry the next morning dawned with a chill that felt out of season. A thin mist clung to the hedges, and the air carried a curious scent, somewhere between garden earth and forgotten paper. In St. Cramwell it was the sort of day that pressed gently on the lungs, encouraging silence rather than speech. But of course, silence was not something the villagers of St. Cramwell had ever practiced with much success. Miss Marple, as was her routine, had breakfasted at 7:30, read the scripture passage for the day, Matthew, something about hypocrisy, and hidden truths, and then made her way to the back garden to peg up her linens. She liked this part of the morning, this hanging of pale sheets and handkerchiefs, the quiet ceremony of domestic order. The world could tumble and twist, but laundry remained a kind of honest anchor. As she clipped the last corner of a pillowcase, she saw young Mary Sims from the post office coming up the lane, her bicycle wobbling slightly under the weight of her bag. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mary called, breathless as she braked and swung her leg down. "Thought I'd take the long route today." The post's mostly dull circulars, one letter for Dr. McKinney, and a small parcel from Shropshire for you." "A parcel?" Miss Marple raised a brow. "That's very unusual." Mary nodded. Brown wrapping, string, no return address, but quite neat. She handed it over with the solemnity of a girl delivering treasure, and Miss Marple tucked it under her arm, without opening it. "Have you heard anything new, Mary?" she asked gently, in the way only Miss Marple could manage without sounding too interested. Mary's cheeks flushed. "Only what everyone else has, I suppose. That the ink was toxic somehow. That she might have swallowed some of it or breathed it in. Inspector Barlow came into the post office yesterday afternoon and asked if we'd seen any strange parcels addressed to Miss Braithwaite. But she never received anything through us, not since she moved here." Said Miss Marple, with no outward reaction. "She used to send a lot of letters, though. Almost daily. Pale blue envelopes. Looked expensive. And always the same name someone in London. Handwriting very precise, too. Calligraphy, I suppose." Miss Marple tucked the information away with a slow nod. "Thank you, Mary." Mary hesitated, then leaned in with the kind of eager caution only the young possess. "Do you think she did it to herself? They're saying maybe she did, that the ink was something she planned. You know, a message." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "No message is worth dying for, dear." And with that, she bid Mary good day, though her eyes lingered on the girl's bicycle until it disappeared around the bend. Inside, the parcel was exactly as Mary had described, neatly wrapped in brown paper, no return address, and tied with a piece of faded green twine. Miss Marple unknotted the string with care and peeled the wrapping back. Inside was a book. It was old, leather-bound, and cracked along the spine. The title, "The Discipline of Ink." Occult inks and symbolic writing was embossed in dull gold. On the first page, in a delicate, practiced hand, was a name. F. Braithwaite. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment. The name, the book, the subject, it was like someone had dropped a stone into her garden pond, and now the ripples were just reaching the edge. That afternoon she attended the ladies' auxiliary meeting at the church hall, where an attempt was made to discuss flower arrangements for the following Sunday's service. It failed. The conversation turned, as all conversations in St. Cramwell now did, to Fenella Braithwaite. "She was so private," said Mrs. Letchford from Lavender. Rise, shaking her head as she wound wool around her fingers. "A mystery from the beginning." "I found her charming," offered Miss Edna Fletcher, surprising everyone. "She had a sadness about her, I thought. A sort of weight." "Or guilt," sniffed Mrs. Crawley, who never liked being outdone in drama. "I heard she spent time in Italy, and you know how those people can be." "Honestly, Jean," murmured Mrs. Beale, "you make it sound like Italy is a den of vice, isn't it?" Miss Marple, seated slightly apart, let the chatter pass over her like wind through lace curtains. She said nothing of the book. She simply listened, gathering impressions, watching hands tremble on teacups, eyes shift at certain names, silence fall at others. When the meeting finally dissolved into excuses and damp umbrellas, Miss Marple lingered, pretending to sort through knitting needles. It was there, alone, that she was joined unexpectedly by Dr. McKinney. "Miss Marple," he said with a slight bow of his head, "I imagine you've heard the coroner's initial report." "Only whispers," she replied. "Nothing official. The ink appears to have been laced with a compound. Not arsenic, not cyanide, something more obscure. Possibly a type of corrosive iodine derivative. They're sending samples to the city for verification." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A peculiar choice for suicide." "Exactly. Which is why I don't believe it was." Dr. McKinney looked around, then lowered his voice. Her throat was burned. Not externally, internally. The ink had to have been ingested, but in minute quantities. More likely she touched her lips or licked the nib. Unconsciously, perhaps, or someone ensured she would. Miss Marple closed her knitting case. She wrote something. "Something with that ink." "She did," said the doctor. "They found a sheet half dried in the vestry, covered in symbols. Not letters, not a poem, just marks." Miss Marple's fingers paused. "Symbols?" Dr. McKinney gave a tight nod. "Strange ones, as if copied from a foreign script, almost ceremonial." When Miss Marple returned home that evening, she placed the book Fenella had set on her writing desk, beside her magnifying glass, her notepaper, and a small envelope of dried violets she'd pressed long ago. She did not open the book again, not. Yet she simply looked out the window, across the rooftops of St. Cramwell, where chimneys began to smoke and curtains trembled in twilight, and somewhere deep in her thoughts a pattern began to stir. Something not quite words, not yet, but coming. Chapter 4. The first suspects. The following day brought a restless wind to St. Cramwell, one that tossed flower petals into the gutters and scattered dry leaves across garden paths, as if nature itself were stirring from some uneasy dream. The church bell struck 10 with an edge of uncertainty, and the sound echoed a little too long in the village square. It was the kind of morning that made even honest people feel as though they'd done something wrong. In the small sitting room of the vicarage, Inspector Barlow sipped weak tea with a pinched expression and stared at a row of photographs above the mantel, smiling faces, neatly posed, caught forever in their Sunday best. He had never been fond of village cases. Everyone knew everyone, and yet no one truly said what they meant. People were polite to the point of sabotage. Too many secrets wrapped in embroidery and lemon drizzle. He cleared his throat. "So you'd say Miss Braithwaite kept to herself?" Mrs. Arbuthnot, seated primly across from him, pressed her hands together. "I wouldn't say kept, Inspector. She circulated very socially minded, in fact, but always elusive. She'd ask many questions but answer few, not unlike yourself." The inspector allowed a ghost of a smile. "Did she have any conflicts? Disagreements?" "Oh, plenty," Mrs. Arbuthnot said without hesitation. "Most of them subtle, of course. She rubbed a few of the women the wrong way, Edna Fletcher in particular. Edna caught her removing a poem from the community bulletin once. Something about themes being too similar. And Henry Dodd, well, there was talk." "What sort of talk?" Mrs. Arbuthnot looked scandalized but delighted. "That he'd proposed, or was planning to. Very sudden, you understand. They'd only been acquainted a matter of weeks. But men make such fools of themselves when a woman knows how to look at them properly." Barlow made a note. "And did she accept?" "She didn't decline, which amounts to the same thing in some circles." After several more such interviews, the inspector took a slow walk toward the solicitor's office, A tidy brick building, with ivy creeping over one side and a brass plate that read Henry Dodd-esque. The blinds were half drawn, and a light burned inside. Though the sun was full in the sky, he knocked once, then again. Finally, Henry Dodd opened the door with the look of a man who had barely slept. "Inspector," he said, "I suppose I knew you'd come. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Dodd, just to understand." Henry stepped aside, motioning to a narrow armchair beside a wall of books. "There's little to understand. I cared for her. She was different. Different how? She made you feel like you weren't invisible. I suppose that's dangerous." Barlow studied him for a long moment. "It's been said you were intending to propose." Henry gave a pained smile. "People talk I did buy a ring. I hadn't offered it yet. What was she to you, Mr. Dodd? A mystery. And a mirror. I never knew what she was thinking, but sometimes she made me remember what I had forgotten about myself." Barlow paused. "Where were you between 11 and 12 on the day of the fete?" "I was helping at the bookstall," Henry said. "I just walked her from the poetry tent when she said she needed to check something at the church. I offered to go with her, but she said no." "And how long was she gone?" "I don't know. 15 minutes, perhaps." Then the commotion began with the ink, and I assumed she'd come back. I went looking for her when she didn't." Barlow took another note. "Did she ever mention enemies? People she feared?" "No," Henry said slowly, "but she did say something once, very softly. She said, 'People don't kill out of hate, Mr. Dodd. They kill out of the fear of being known.' I thought she was being poetic, but now I'm not sure." Later that afternoon, Barlow made his way to Miss Edna Fletcher's modest cottage on Lavender Rise. The path was lined with trimmed hedges, but a single rosebush had grown wild, its branches twisted like questions unanswered. Edna opened the door briskly. She was a stern woman in her 60s with a stiff spine and shrewd eyes. Her house smelled of peppermint and starch. "You've come to ask if I killed her," she said without preamble. Barlow blinked. "That's rather direct. I haven't the time for embroidery. I disliked her, yes, but not enough to send her off with a bottle of poisoned ink." "Why did you dislike her?" "She was false. I've lived here 37 years, Inspector. I know when someone is performing village life. She didn't care about us, or the fete, or the poetry. She wanted something." Barlow tilted his head. "And what do you think she wanted?" Edna folded her arms. "To belong to something she'd lost, or to fix something she'd broken. But she went about it the wrong way, poking into people's pasts, asking sly questions. She once asked me if I knew a Viola Harwood. I don't. But it wasn't the name that struck me. It was her face when she asked. She looked like someone knocking on a door they weren't sure should ever open." "Did she ever mention where she came from?" "Not clearly. Said she'd moved around. But she had the eyes of someone who'd stood behind a one-way mirror too long, watching, waiting." Barlow stood. "Thank you, Miss Fletcher. One more thing. What do you think of Henry Dodd?" Edna sighed. "He's too lonely to be dangerous, but loneliness has teeth." That evening the sun fell like a slow sigh over St. Cramwell, painting the streets gold and hollow. Inspector Barlow returned to his rented room above the grocer's and stared at his notes, none of them quite matching, none of them quite wrong. He had suspects. He had motives both faint and flickering, but only one person, he realized, had asked no questions. Only one had simply watched, and that was Miss Marple. Chapter 5. A clue in the paper fiber's rain fell gently over St. Cramwell the next morning. Soft enough not to cause alarm, but persistent enough to make the cobbles shine and keep the streets quiet. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her small parlor, a wool shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and the mysterious book from Fenella Braithwaite resting on her lap. She had read it twice through now, not with the mind of a student, but that of an archivist, looking not for facts but for patterns. The ink formulas listed inside were peculiar combinations of natural dyes, root extractions, and substances, with names that whispered of antiquity: dragon's blood resin, belladonna tincture, iodine crystals ground in opal mortar. But what struck Miss Marple most wasn't the chemistry, it was the philosophy. The chapter titles read like riddles: ink as revelation, ink as concealment, ink that remembers, ink that forgets. Each page seemed less about writing and more about intent. She gently closed the book and reached for the page Fenella had sent weeks earlier, tucked carefully into a folder. Miss Marple had kept it without knowing why, a single sheet of handmade paper with delicate looping calligraphy. Not a poem, not a letter, merely a collection of symbols arranged in no discernible order. Triangles, slashes, dots, and curved lines like half-written music. But today she noticed something she hadn't before. There was a faint watermark in the lower corner, barely visible unless held to the firelight. A mark resembling a broken thistle, and beneath it a single word pressed into the fibers so lightly it didn't stain only: I-N-D-E-D. Worley.Miss. Marple's brow furrowed. Worley was a name she hadn't heard in many years, a small estate on the outskirts of Brixford, long since fallen into neglect. It had once belonged to the Harwood family. Viola Harwood, she thought suddenly. The name Edna Fletcher had mentioned, the name Fenella had asked about. The thread was faint, but it was there, woven through the ink, the estate, and the woman who had died trying to make something right. She stood, folding the note carefully, and made her way to the hall, where her raincoat and hat waited, like old accomplices. If a place appeared on a page, she reasoned, it had not yet vanished from the world. Outside, the rain soft to a mist. The walk to Brixford took the better part of an hour, but Miss Marple welcomed the solitude. The hedgerows were dripping with memory, and the fields held the scent of turned earth and wild mint. When she reached the edge of the Worley estate, the gate sagged open on rusted hinges. The manor beyond had all but crumbled ivy overtook. The chimney's windows blinked dark and empty, but one section of the lower structure remained intact. A small library annex, brick-faced and slate-roofed, seemed to have survived the weather better than the rest. Miss Marple followed the path around and found the door slightly ajar. Inside, it smelled of paper and mildew. The shelves, though dusty, still held books. A small reading desk stood near a window that had been broken and boarded up with planks. A soft scattering of dried leaves covered the rug. She paused near the desk, noticing something, a blotter old, leather-bound with corners, cracked from use. She touched it gently. Beneath the dust was a faint stain, not fresh but familiar. A reddish-purple tint sunk deep into the leather, the same hue as the ink that had stained Fenella's poem. She brushed the blotter aside and discovered a torn scrap of paper beneath it. On it were more symbols. They matched the ones Fenella had written. Miss Marple took a long breath, her eyes narrowing. This was not simply some poetic eccentricity. Fenella had come here recently enough to leave ink, and she had written something in the same pattern she later copied at the fete. Something was being replicated, preserved, or deciphered. As she turned to go, she noticed something else, a faint footprint in the dust, too large for her own, and recent. Someone else had come here, someone taller, heavier, likely a man. That afternoon, back in St. Cramwell, Inspector Barlow knocked on her door. Miss Marple received him with calm cordiality and led him into her parlor, where tea and lemon biscuits had already been laid. "You've been out walking," he said, noting her damp coat. "To Worley," she said simply. "You're familiar with it?" Barlow blinked. "The old Harwood place? Barely standing? Why?" Miss Marple handed him the tea, the torn paper from the annex. "Because Miss Braithwaite was there, recently, and she wrote this." Barlow studied the markings, the same symbols as the vestry. She was searching for something, perhaps trying to uncover a message left behind, but someone else had been there too. "I saw the footprints." Barlow's expression changed. Wariness, perhaps, or something like respect. "You think this is where it began?" "I think it never quite ended," Miss Marple said softly. "The ink was not merely a tool. It was a key to something that had been locked away." Barlow leaned forward. "Who is Viola Harwood, Miss Marple?" "You've heard the name." Miss Marple nodded. "A young woman who vanished from public life some 20 years ago. She lived at Worley. Rumors of scandal, of course an inheritance dispute, a missing manuscript, and eventually silence. But I think Fenella knew her, or perhaps was related to her." Barlow tapped the paper. "And this? I believe it's part of that manuscript. A code or a curse, depending on how one interprets such things. I don't deal in superstition, Inspector, but I do believe in desperation. Someone didn't want those symbols to be seen again." Barlow stood, suddenly thoughtful. "Do you think someone here in this village knew what she was doing?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle and unassuming. "Inspector, in my experience, murderers rarely come from elsewhere. The wind may carry secrets in, but blood is always spilled by familiar hands." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the mist remained, curling around the corners of houses and hedges, wrapping St. Cramwell in its pale uncertainty. And somewhere, beneath its veil, someone was waiting, ink-stained hands trembling, watching the pieces fall slowly into place. Chapter 6. Teacups and Tensions St. Cramwell was not a village that took well to suspense. By the end of the week, the residents had grown fidgety and sharp-eyed, their once pleasant routines strained by the shadow that refused to pass. The market was quieter. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when someone else entered the room. Even the church choir rehearsals were subdued, their harmonies tinged with something brittle. Miss Marple, however, maintained her calm. She had always known that evil, when it visited, never announced itself with horns or fanfare. It slipped, and quietly wore ordinary shoes, and sometimes smiled over a teacup. That was why she had invited Henry Dodd to tea. He arrived at 4:30, precisely on time, his suit a little creased, and his eyes somewhat red-rimmed. She greeted him gently, ushered him to the fireside chair, and served tea in the good porcelain. No lemon, just milk. He had always taken it that way. "I hope it's not too soon," she said softly, pouring his cup. "Not at all," he replied. "Truthfully, it's a relief to get out of that office. Everyone wants something answers I don't have, or condolences I don't need." She stirred her own cup. "That's grief, I'm afraid. It makes people either very kind or very foolish." Henry gave a quiet, strained smile, sometimes both. For a few minutes they sat in companionable silence. Outside, sparrows flitted across the hedge, shaking raindrops from the leaves. A cat padded down the lane, unhurried and dry despite the earlier downpour. Miss Marple observed all this as Henry stared at his hands, which trembled faintly against the rim of the saucer. "She sent me something," Miss Marple said finally. He looked up. "Who?" "Miss Braithwaite. A book before she died. Rather an unusual one, about ink and symbols and forgotten scripts." Henry blinked. She was always writing, always drawing. "But I thought it was poetry." "It may have been once," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe in the end it was something else, something closer to truth." Henry swallowed. "I never asked much about her past. I thought I was being respectful, but perhaps I was being a coward." She mentioned Viola Harwood to Edna Fletcher. Henry froze. His teacup clicked faintly against the saucer. "I hadn't heard that name in years," he said slowly. "But yes, I remember. My father handled the Harwood estate, what was left of it, after the scandal." "What scandal?" He hesitated. "Viola was disinherited, allegedly for theft, a rare manuscript something to do with spiritualism and family rights. But no charges were ever brought. She simply disappeared. The family pretended she had died." "And you think Fenella might have been related?" "I'm beginning to think so." Miss Marple gave a soft hum. "She came to this village not just for the quiet, then, but to recover something." "To uncover?" "It—" Henry's expression shifted. Do you think she was murdered because of that?" "I think she touched a memory someone had spent decades trying to bury." There was a knock at the door, just then polite, but quick. Miss Marple excused herself and returned moments later with Inspector Barlow in tow, his mackintosh still wet at the shoulders. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, nodding. At Henry, "I was hoping for a word with Miss Marple, but perhaps I've arrived at the right moment." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, then turned back to the tea tray. "Inspector, we were just discussing the Harwood estate." "Ah," said Barlow, removing a small notebook from his coat. "Then this may interest you. I've received a report from the city lab. The ink used in Miss Braithwaite's calligraphy contains a rare compound manganese violet, combined with iodine and crushed willow bark. Not lethal on its own, but highly corrosive to mucous tissue." Henry flinched. "She didn't swallow it," Barlow added. "It seems it was absorbed slowly, likely through skin contact fingertips, perhaps. Or transferred when she wiped her lips absent-mindedly. She may not have even noticed until it was too late." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "So it wasn't poured into anything, no malicious delivery, just the ink itself." Barlow nodded. "But it was deliberately altered. Not a product found on shelves. Someone made it. "Which narrows our field considerably," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Barlow replied, "especially when paired with something else." He pulled a photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a picture of the symbols written by Fenella at the fete. Miss Marple leaned in, eyes scanning the arcs and lines. "This particular configuration," Barlow continued, tapping one of the symbols, "has been found before in a court record from 1909 relating to a ritual text called the Harwood Codex, banned in its time for reasons no one ever properly explained. Thought lost after the Harwood's estate was broken up, and now resurfacing through ink and paper," said Miss Marple. "Fenella was trying to retrieve the codex, or what remained of it, perhaps to reclaim her family name, or prove a truth." Henry rubbed his forehead. "She said once, quietly, 'History isn't what's remembered, Mr. Dodd. It's what's allowed to remain.' I thought she meant poetry." Inspector Barlow leaned back. "Who had access to her ink supply?" "She kept it close," said Henry, "but she lent a bottle to the vicar's wife for the church banners. And Edna once borrowed a pen from her during the committee meeting." Miss Marple rose and fetched her notebook from the sideboard. "May I ask, Inspector, whether any paper was recovered from the vestry desk? Anything that hadn't been soaked?" Barlow considered. "A single scrap. It was folded beneath a blotter, unmarked. We assumed it was unrelated." "May I see it?" He retrieved it from his coat. Miss Marple took it in her hands, holding it near the firelight. Her gaze lingered on the corner. "There," she whispered, "the watermark." Henry leaned closer. "Worley?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but different. It's not broken, as before." "It's whole." Barlow frowned. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes calm and steady. "It means we're not the only ones tracing Fenella's path. Someone else knew about the codex, someone who had seen the original, and they are very carefully removing every trace of it that Fenella left behind." She folded the page carefully, handed it back. "I believe," she said, "that the next clue isn't in what we can read, but in what was never allowed to be written." And the rain, gentle once again, began tapping on the windows like distant fingers urging them to look back. Chapter 7. Secrets Behind Stitched Curtains. Following morning broke with a clarity that felt unearned. The skies over St. Cramwell had shed their shroud of drizzle, revealing a brittle sun and wind-washed rooftops. Birds returned to their places on eaves and chimney pots, and yet the air remained taut, as if something still trembled beneath the surface of the village. Miss Marple, as ever, took her morning walk. Her cane clicked lightly on the cobbles, her step unhurried. She nodded to the milkman, paused to inspect the first blooms on the hedge roses, and then turned up Lavender Rise. It was not a route she took often. It was steeper than she liked. But this morning she had a reason. Edna Fletcher was trimming her front garden with uncharacteristic aggression, snipping away at the clematis vine as though it had insulted her. She straightened when she saw Miss Marple approaching, wiping her hands on a tea towel tucked into her apron. "Miss Marple," she said warily, though not without respect. "Morning's crisp, isn't it?" "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "A good day for clarity." Edna raised a brow. "Is that so?" "I wonder," Miss Marple said, stepping inside the little front gate. "If you might spare a moment, I was hoping we could talk." Edna hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Come." "Inside, then." No point standing in the wind. The house was spotless, of course. Every cushion aligned, every doily starched. The kind of house where nothing went missing unless it was meant to. Edna poured 2 cups of tea strong and unsweetened and sat opposite, Miss Marple with her chin slightly lifted. "I imagine you're here about Fenella." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She asked you about Viola Harwood, didn't she?" Edna's face flickered, then stilled. "She did. And you told her you didn't know the name. I didn't lie." "Not exactly." Edna folded her hands. "I didn't know Viola Harwood, but I knew of her. Everyone did once, but we were told not to speak of it. Told by the vicar, by the Harwoods themselves, before they vanished into disgrace. It was like there'd been a funeral, but no one got to grieve." Miss Marple waited. Edna continued, voice lower now. "My aunt was a housemaid at Worley when the Harwood scandal happened. She said Viola was strange, not wicked, just out of place. She wrote constantly, things no one could read, symbols, drawings. Her father hated it, thought it dangerous, said she was tampering with things God had not meant for young ladies to touch." "Did your aunt mention a manuscript?" "She did. Said it was locked in a cabinet with 3 keys. Viola had one. Her father had another. The third was kept by a solicitor in Brixford, Henry Dodd's father, I suppose. When it went missing, the cabinet was broken. They said Viola stole it. She disappeared the next day." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And your aunt?" "She left Worley not long after. Said the house had changed. The atmosphere was different, like all the warmth had gone." There was a long silence between them. The wind tickled at the curtains. "I think Fenella came here to recover that manuscript," Miss Marple said gently. "To finish what her ancestors started, or perhaps to understand why it was hidden." Edna's eyes darkened. "And you think someone killed her to stop her?" "I do," Miss Marple said, "but not in anger. In fear, not of what she was, but of what she might reveal." She placed her empty cup on the saucer and stood slowly. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Fletcher, and for the honesty. We cannot change the past, but we can sometimes understand it." Edna didn't rise. She only nodded, her jaw tight. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she noticed a small embroidery hoop on the window-sill, half finished, the needle still tucked in the thread. The pattern was odd, not flowers, not birds, symbols, triangles, dots, curved lines. She didn't comment. She simply continued down Lavender Rise. Back in her parlor, she found Inspector Barlow waiting, standing beside her bookshelf with a notebook in hand. He turned as she entered. "I've come across something interesting," he said. "We examined the ink bottle found in Miss Braithwaite's satchel. The residue at the bottom didn't match the ink she used on the poem." Miss Marple raised her brow. "Meaning it had been swapped?" "Yes," Barlow said. "Possibly the night before the fete. We also found traces of a powder inside the bottle, iodine crystals. Someone prepared that ink for her, or rather, prepared it against her, and the person who did it," Miss Marple murmured, "must have had access to her things, and knowledge of the formula." Barlow nodded. "We only have a few names who fit both." "Mrs. Arbuthnot, Miss Marple," said Barlow blinked. "The vicar's wife? She helped with the fate banners. Borrowed Fenella's ink. She's not as pious as she looks, Inspector. She's clever. She listens. And she has a long memory for scandal. Barlow scribbled a note. What motive? She believes in order, Miss Marple said, and Fenella threatened it, with her questions, her history, her refusal to remain within the bounds of acceptable conversation. Barlow paced. We'll bring her in, quietly. Miss Marple, however, shook her head. Not yet. She won't confess to you, but she may to me, because she doesn't see me as dangerous, only old, only ornamental. That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong at the church, slipping in quietly, sitting 2 rows behind Mrs. Arbuthnot. The service passed in murmured prayers and organ sighs. But after the final hymn, as the parishioners trickled out, Miss Marple remained seated. Mrs. Arbuthnot turned, surprised. Still praying, Miss Marple? Reflecting, she said, on thistles and ink and manuscripts, and how sometimes righteousness becomes cruelty in disguise. Mrs. Arbuthnot froze, her gloved hands tightening around her hymn-book. Miss Marple met her gaze, calm and unwavering. You knew about the manuscript, didn't you? About the Harwoods? About the girl who disappeared. And when Fenella arrived, with her symbols and her silent grief, you decided history couldn't be allowed to surface. Double quotes. Mrs. Arbuthnot's lips parted, but no sound came. You didn't mean for her to die, Miss Marple said. But once the ink was changed, you let it happen. The church bell struck 7. The echo lingered. Mrs. Arbuthnot turned away, walked slowly out into the night. Miss Marple remained a moment longer, gazing at the altar where light met shadow, in delicate balance. The past, she thought, always bleeds through, especially when written in ink that refuses to fade. Chapter 8. The second spill. By the following morning, a strange stillness had taken hold of St. Cramwell, not the peace of restoration, but the hush that lingers before a storm breaks in. Fool. The village, sensing some unseen shift, carried on with brittle routine. Milk bottles collected, washing hung with care, and eyes darting more than usual when voices rose too sharply. Miss Marple's kitchen was steeped in the fragrance of boiled eggs and toasting crumpets. She moved methodically, placing breakfast on a tray and settling beside the hearth, but her mind was far from eggs and jam. It hovered instead around Mrs. Arbuthnot, who had left the church the previous evening with silence pressed to her lips, and something far more dangerous caught in her throat. She had not confessed, but she had cracked. And that, Miss Marple knew, was when truth began to slip in through the Fisher's dot at precisely 9:15. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mary Sims from the post office once more, cheeks flushed with haste and urgency. There's been another incident, she said breathlessly. At the schoolhouse. Miss Marple blinked. The school? They've been painting banners for the Autumn Harvest Festival, Mary said, already leading the way. Miss Cartwright asked the children to use leftover supplies from the fete. Someone found a bottle of ink said to be from Miss Braithwaite's table, and when one of the girls used it, the paper curled, started to smoke a little, gave her a rash on her fingers. She's fine now, just frightened. Miss Marple paused only to gather her shawl and walking stick. As they reached the schoolhouse, the air was already thick with curiosity and concern. Miss Cartwright, the headmistress, stood outside under the shelter of the stone lintel, looking paler than usual, her hair pinned back in slightly uneven haste. She's all right, she assured Miss Marple. The girl Emily just startled, that's all. It didn't burn through, but it puckered the paper terribly, and the smell acrid, like wet matches. Miss Marple was ushered inside. On a desk near the window lay the offending sheet, scorched. Faintly at the edges, a swath of violet-black ink pooled across the center. The paper itself was soft, fibrous handmade, not the usual school stock. She picked it up delicately with gloved fingers. "The ink's the same," she murmured. "Modified. Altered, but not as potent as before." Miss Cartwright nodded. I went back to the supply cupboard. The bottle had a label, "Poetry Tint Reserved," and initials, H.D. Miss Marple stilled. Henry Dodd? I believe so, though it's possible someone else labeled it in his name. Later that afternoon, Inspector Barlow stood in Miss Marple's parlor again, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a kind of weary dread. "We're chasing ghosts," he muttered. "Every bottle, every scrap of paper, it's like she left a trail on purpose." "She didn't," Miss Marple said quietly. "But someone else did, or tried to." Barlow frowned. "To confuse us?" "To confuse her," Miss Marple corrected. "To make her believe she was being followed by shadows instead of people. To make her doubt what she knew." Barlow dropped into the armchair with a sigh. The ink was planted, and the schoolhouse incident was meant to stir panic. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and to remind us that the danger still lingers." Barlow opened his notebook again. "I visited Henry Dodd this morning. He insists he didn't label that bottle, but something in his manner, it was off. Not guilt, just tension. He loved her," Miss Marple said, "or thought he did." Barlow nodded. "And yet he's hiding something important." Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. She pulled out Fenella's original letter, the one with the symbols, and studied it again. "It's not just that someone wanted the codex lost," she said, half to herself. "They wanted her lost, too, her questions, her resolve. They wanted to muddy the trail, to make her seem unstable. Imagine how easy it would have been to dismiss her, to call her obsessed, confused, dramatic." Barlow stood. "And in that confusion they delivered a murder that could look like misadventure." Miss Marple looked up at him. "But someone made a mistake." Barlow raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She tapped the edge of the paper. "The watermark." He stepped closer. "There are two kinds. One from the manuscript paper she used marked Whirly with a broken thistle, and one from the schoolhouse ink spill-marked with the same word, but the thistle whole. And the second only shows up in a new batch." "You're saying the schoolhouse paper came after her death?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And only one person had reason to create more, because they believed the original manuscript still existed and wanted to destroy it, or keep it for themselves." Barlow's voice was low. "Henry." Miss Marple nodded. "He never meant for her to die. I think he truly hoped to marry her. But when she grew closer to unlocking the codex's meaning, he panicked, not out of hatred but fear. Fear of what it might." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She asked you about Viola Harwood, didn't she?" Edna's face flickered, then stilled. "She did. And you told her you didn't know the name." "I didn't lie." "Not exactly." Edna folded her hands. "I didn't know Viola Harwood, but I knew of her. Everyone did once, but we were told not to speak of it. Told by the vicar, by the Harwoods themselves, before they vanished into disgrace. It was like there'd been a funeral, But no one got to grieve. Miss Marple waited. Edna continued, voice lower now. My aunt was a housemaid at Worley when the Harwood scandal happened. She said Viola was strange, not wicked, just out of place. She wrote constantly, things no one could read. Symbols, drawings. Her father hated it, thought it dangerous. Said she was tampering with things God had not meant for young ladies to touch. Did your aunt mention a manuscript? She did. Said it was locked in a cabinet with 3 keys. Viola had one. Her father had another. The third was kept by a solicitor in Brixford, Henry Dodd's father, I suppose. When it went missing, the cabinet was broken. They said Viola stole it. She disappeared the next day. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And your aunt? She left Worley not long after. Said the house had changed. The atmosphere was different, like all the warmth had gone. There was a long silence between them. The wind tickled at the curtains. I think Fenella came here to recover that manuscript, Miss Marple said gently. To finish what her ancestors started, or perhaps to understand why it was hidden. Edna's eyes darkened. And you think someone killed her to stop her? I do, Miss Marple said, but not in anger. In fear, not of what she was, but of what she might reveal. She placed her empty cup on the saucer and stood slowly. Thank you for the tea, Miss Fletcher, and for the honesty. We cannot change the past, but we can sometimes understand it. Edna didn't rise. She only nodded, her jaw tight. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she noticed a small embroidery hoop on the window-sill half finished, the needle still tucked in the thread. The pattern was odd, not flowers, not birds, symbols, triangles, dots, curved lines. She didn't comment. She simply continued down Lavender Rise. Back in her parlor, she found Inspector Barlow waiting, standing beside her bookshelf with a notebook in hand. He turned as she entered. I've come across something interesting, he said. We examined the ink bottle found in Miss Braithwaite's satchel. The residue at the bottom didn't match the ink she used on the poem. Miss Marple raised her brow. Meaning it had been swapped? Yes, Barlow said. Possibly the night before the fete. We also found traces of a powder inside the bottle iodine crystals. Someone prepared that ink for her, or rather, prepared it against her. And the person who did it, Miss Marple murmured, must have had access to her things, and knowledge of the formula. Barlow nodded. We only have a few names who fit both. Mrs. Arbuthnot, Miss Marple, said. Barlow blinked. The vicar's wife? She helped with the fate banners. Borrowed Fenella's ink. She's not as pious as she looks, Inspector. She's clever. She listens. And she has a long memory for scandal. Barlow scribbled a note. What motive? She believes in order, Miss Marple said. And Fenella threatened it. With her questions, her history, her refusal to remain within the bounds of acceptable conversation. Barlow paced. We'll bring her in, quietly. Miss Marple, however, shook her head. Not yet. She won't confess to you, but she may to me, because she doesn't see me as dangerous, only old, only ornamental. That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong at the church, slipping in quietly, sitting 2 rows behind Mrs. Arbuthnot. The service passed in murmured prayers and organ sighs. But after the final hymn, as the parishioners trickled out, Miss Marple remained seated. Mrs. Arbuthnot turned, surprised. Still praying, Miss Marple? Reflecting, she said. on thistles and ink and manuscripts, and how sometimes righteousness becomes cruelty in disguise. Mrs. Arbuthnot froze, her gloved hands tightening around her hymn book. Miss Marple met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "You knew about the manuscript, didn't you? About the Harwoods? About the girl who disappeared? And when Fenella arrived, with her symbols and her silent grief, you decided history couldn't be allowed to surface. Double quotes. Mrs. Arbuthnot's lips parted, but no sound came. "You didn't mean for her to die," Miss Marple said. "But once the ink was changed, you let it happen." The church bell struck 7. The echo lingered. Mrs. Arbuthnot turned away, walked slowly out into the night. Miss Marple remained a moment longer, gazing at the altar where light met shadow. In delicate balance, the past, she thought, always bleeds through, especially when written in ink that refuses to fade. Chapter 8. The second spill. By the following morning, a strange stillness had taken hold of St. Cramwell, not the peace of restoration, but the hush that lingers before a storm breaks in. Full. The village, sensing some unseen shift, carried on with brittle routine. Milk bottles collected, washing hung with care, and eyes darting more than usual when voices rose too sharply. Miss Marple's kitchen was steeped in the fragrance of boiled eggs and toasting crumpets. She moved methodically, placing breakfast on a tray and settling beside the hearth, but her mind was far from eggs and jam. It hovered instead around Mrs. Arbuthnot, who had left the church the previous evening with silence pressed to her lips, and something far more dangerous caught in her throat. She had not confessed, but she had cracked. And that, Miss Marple knew, was when truth began to slip in through the fissures. At precisely 9:15, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mary Sims from the post office once more, cheeks flushed with haste and urgency. "There's been another incident," she said breathlessly. "At the schoolhouse." Miss Marple blinked. "The school?" "They've been painting banners for the Autumn Harvest Festival," Mary said, already leading the way. Miss Cartwright asked the children to use leftover supplies from the fete. Someone found a bottle of ink said to be from Miss Braithwaite's table, and when one of the girls used it, the paper curled, started to smoke a little, gave her a rash on her fingers. She's fine now, just frightened. Miss Marple paused only to gather her shawl and walking stick. As they reached the schoolhouse, the air was already thick with curiosity and concern. Miss Cartwright, the headmistress, stood outside under the shelter of the stone lintel, looking paler than usual, her hair pinned back in slightly uneven haste. "She's all right," she assured Miss Marple. "The girl Emily just startled, that's all. It didn't burn through, but it puckered the paper terribly. And the smell acrid like wet matches." Miss Marple was ushered inside. On a desk near the window lay the offending sheet, scorched. Faintly at the edges, a swath of violet-black ink pooled across the center. The paper itself was soft, fibrous handmade, not the usual school stock. She picked it up delicately with gloved fingers. "The ink's the same," she murmured. "Modified. Altered, but not as potent as before." Miss Cartwright nodded. I went back to the supply cupboard. The bottle had a label, poetry tent reserved, and initials, Het. Miss Marple stilled. "Henry Dodd? I believe so, though it's possible someone else labeled it in his name." Later that afternoon, Inspector Barlow stood in Miss Marple's parlor again, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a kind of weary dread, "We're chasing ghosts," he muttered. "Every bottle, every scrap of paper, it's like she left a trail on purpose." "She didn't," Miss Marple said quietly. "But someone else did, or tried to." Barlow frowned. "To confuse us?" "To confuse her," Miss Marple corrected. "To make her believe she was being followed by shadows instead of people. To make her doubt what she knew." Barlow dropped into the armchair with a sigh. The ink was planted, and the schoolhouse incident was meant to stir panic. "Miss." Marple nodded. "Yes, and to remind us that the danger still lingers." Barlow opened his notebook again. "I visited Henry Dodd this morning. He insists he didn't label that bottle, but something in his manner, it was off. Not guilt, just tension. He loved her," Miss Marple said, "or thought he did." Barlow nodded. "And yet he's hiding something important." Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. She pulled out Fenella's original letter, the one with the symbols, and studied it again. "It's not just that someone wanted the codex lost," she said, half to herself. "They wanted her lost, too. Her questions, her resolve. They wanted to muddy the trail, to make her seem unstable. Imagine how easy it would have been to dismiss her, to call her obsessed, confused, dramatic." Barlow stood. "And in that confusion they delivered a murder that could look like misadventure." Miss Marple looked up at him. "But someone made a mistake." Barlow raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She tapped the edge of the paper. "The watermark." He stepped closer. "There are two kinds. One from the manuscript paper she used marked Worley with a broken thistle, and one from the schoolhouse ink spill-marked with the same word but the thistle whole. And the second only shows up in a new batch." "You're saying the schoolhouse paper came after her death?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And only one person had reason to create more, because they believed the original manuscript still existed and wanted to destroy it, or keep it for themselves." Barlow's voice was low. "Henry." Miss Marple nodded. "He never meant for her to die. I think he truly hoped to marry her. But when she grew closer to unlocking the codex's meaning, he panicked, not out of hatred but fear. Fear of what it might reveal about the Harwoods, about his own father, perhaps about himself." Barlow took a breath. "You think he poisoned the ink?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but I think he provided the paper. And once the ink had done its work, he made sure no one could trace the truth of what she had written, except that someone else had already seen it." Barlow paused. "Mrs. Arbuthnot?" Miss Marple turned to the window, where dusk had begun to settle. "No," she said softly. She tried to suppress it for the sake of respectability. But Henry, he tried to own it. And that's the more dangerous thing. Barlow moved toward the door. "We'll bring him in." Miss Marple nodded, gently. "He may not have killed her, but he knows who did, and he knows why." As the inspector left, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire, folding Fenella's letter in careful thirds. The paper still smelled faintly of ink, but beneath the scent, and the symbols and the lies, there remained the ghost of something that could not be erased. Truth, written by a hand that had already paid its price. And outside, the village slept, sheets drawn, doors bolted, yet never quite beyond hearing. Distance of the ink that still whispered in silence. Chapter 9. The ink beneath the ash be the time Inspector Barlow questioned Henry Dodd, formally. The sky had turned the color of pressed lavender, and the sun had retreated behind a bank of sullen clouds. Inside the solicitor's modest office, the once orderly shelves now looked crooked, and the scent of old parchment mingled uneasily with the metallic tang of nervous sweat. Henry sat rigid behind his desk, his usually smooth voice now hoarse, faltering at the edges. He cleared his throat. I didn't mean for anything to happen to her. I didn't poison her. I loved her. Barlow's tone remained measured. We're not accusing you of murder, Mr. Dodd, but the bottle found at the schoolhouse marked with your initials was filled with ink nearly identical to the one that caused Fenella's death. Why was your name on it? I don't know, Henry whispered. I didn't label it. I never even handled that bottle. But you did have access to her papers, the handmade stock, the Worley watermark. Henry's hands twitched on the desk. Yes. Barlow leaned forward. And you didn't tell us that before. Henry's breath caught, because I thought it didn't matter. The paper wasn't dangerous, but it connected you to the material surrounding her death. Henry closed his eyes. She showed me one of the pages, he said finally, weeks before the fate. Said it came from something hidden long ago. Said it belonged to her grandmother or great-aunt, Viola. She believed it was meant to be found. She said it wasn't just writing, it was memory preserved through ink. A kind of sacred reckoning. Barlow waited. I didn't believe her. Henry continued, more softly now. At first I thought she was swept up in the romance of it. But then I saw what she was copying. The symbols, the patterns, I recognized one. From something in the back of my father's ledger. He must have been involved somehow, perhaps, as the solicitor who held the third key to that locked cabinet at Worley. You never confronted him? He's long gone, Henry said bitterly. But when I asked around quietly, I found an old envelope tucked in a book from his estate. Inside was a sheet marked with the same symbols Fenella had shown me. So you knew she was right, Barlow said. Henry nodded. I knew she was close to something real, but she didn't know how dangerous it made her. I tried to warn her to slow her down. I told her to stop writing with that ink, that it was making people nervous. She just smiled and said, Good, maybe they should be. And the day of the fate? I didn't see her before she went into the vestry, he said, barely audible now. But I found the paper she left. Symbols again. One I hadn't seen before. It wasn't from the envelope. It was new. As if she had translated something. Barlow looked up sharply. Where's that paper now? I burned it, Henry confessed. Barlow stared at him in silence for several long seconds. Then, quietly, Why? Because it frightened me. Meanwhile, back in her parlor, Miss Marple was speaking with someone else entirely. A small figure stood near the bookshelf, nervously wringing her gloved hands. Mary Sims. I didn't mean to snoop, she said quickly. It's just I remembered something strange from the post-office ledger. A parcel sent by Miss Braithwaite, the day before she died. I wasn't there that morning, but I checked the log. Miss Marple looked up with interest. And it was addressed to an archive in Edinburgh, the Royal Collection Registry. But the description was vague manuscript sample and personal correspondence. And has it arrived? Mary nodded. It was signed for the following morning. Miss Marple leaned back. So she made sure a part of her work survived, even if the rest was destroyed. Yes, and the clerk who signed it, he sent a note back. It arrived today. Said the symbols were consistent with early 20th century symbolic literature and possibly related to suppressed family histories, tied to spiritualist movements in England. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It survived. How clever she was. As Mary left, Miss Marple sat in silence for a long time, turning the idea over in her mind. Fenella had known, somehow, that her time was limited. Perhaps she hadn't feared death, but erasure the same. Fate Viola had met Dot. She had mailed her truth just in time. Later that evening, as dusk soaked the village in blue and gray, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The grass was damp but clean, and the headstones leaned like old friends listening to one another's sorrows. Near the vestry door stood Inspector Barlow, arms folded, face unreadable. "He burned it," he said. "I know," Miss Marple replied. "Because it changed him." Barlow glanced over. "It wasn't guilt that made him tremble. It was wonder." Miss Marple nodded. The symbols weren't just decoration. They held something, and whatever it was too much for him. Barlow exhaled. "And now we've no evidence." "We've enough," Miss Marple said softly. "Because someone else tried to cover the truth and failed." Barlow tilted his head. "Mrs. Arbuthnot? She still believes silence is safety. She tampered with the ink. I'm sure of it, but not to kill. Only to ruin. The toxicity came from a later hand. A second mixing." Barlow frowned. "So who did that?" Miss Marple looked to the darkening sky. "Someone who feared the ink wouldn't only speak, it would name." Barlow turned. "We still don't know who added the final ingredient." "No," Miss Marple said, "but we will. Because the person who did it has made one fatal mistake." Barlow arched an eyebrow. "They assumed that because the words are gone, the meaning has vanished. But the symbols survive. In Fenella's letters, in the schoolhouse page, in the minds of those she touched, and soon in the records of a royal archive." She turned, walking slowly toward the gate. "The dead leave behind more than silence, Inspector. They leave patterns. And I've been reading them." Behind her, the church bell chimed once soft, distant, mournful, the sound of memory coming. Home. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's final test. It was a crisp, clear morning in St. Cramwell. One of those rare days where the light seemed to expose rather than illuminate. The hedgerows had taken on a deeper green, and the air carried a faint metallic sharpness, like the breath of something watching. In the corner of her parlor, Miss Marple folded a clean handkerchief with the kind of care reserved for funerals or revelations. She had not slept much the night before. Sleep was often unnecessary when a mind had already solved something, but waited to prove it. She rose and selected a shawl, pale gray, with a subtle floral fringe, then placed a single sheet paper into her handbag. The symbols on it, penned by Fenella's hand, had not changed, but Miss Marple had begun to understand why they had been chosen. Not for decoration, not for ritual, but for memory. At 10:30, she arrived at the vicarage unannounced. Mrs. Arbuthnot was trimming dead heads from her hydrangeas and glanced up with a tight smile, her gloved hands barely pausing. "Miss Marple," she said, "I do hope this isn't a formal visit. The vicar is in Brixford attending a meeting with the diocesan board." "Not formal," Miss Marple replied. "Merely a chat. May I?" Mrs. Arbuthnot hesitated, then gestured to the garden bench. The two women sat, the air between them as crisp as the breeze brushing the treetops. "I wanted to thank you, Miss," Marple began gently, "for the way you've handled everything since the fete. It cannot be easy keeping the village together." Mrs. Arbuthnot's posture softened just slightly. "We do what we must. The world doesn't pause for grief, especially when it's inconvenient." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "But sometimes it's the inconvenient things that carry truth, like ink that refuses to lift, or symbols that resurface despite every effort to bury them." The vicar's wife said nothing, but the garden shears in her hand tensed. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued softly, "about the day before the fete. The calligraphy supplies were stored in the parish cupboard, yes? And you were tasked with labeling the banners? That's correct. And you had access to the ink Miss Braithwaite brought in because you were working beside her." "I borrowed it for 5 minutes," Mrs. Arbuthnot said sharply. "It was a kind gesture," she offered. "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and I believe you had no intention of harming her." Mrs. Arbuthnot stood, brushing soil from her apron. "I see. So this is the real purpose of your visit." Miss Marple looked up at her, calm and unblinking. "You replaced the ink to sabotage the poem, to prevent her from displaying it. You found the formula, perhaps from a reference left behind in the church library, or spoken of by someone who remembered the Harwoods. But the final mix, the ingredient that poisoned her, was not yours. And how would you know that?" the vicar's wife asked tightly. "Because the ink used at the schoolhouse later was less toxic than the one Fenella used," Miss Marple said. "Someone attempted to recreate it, but not with the same precision. Only the originator would have known how potent it was. You only wanted to destroy her work, not her." Mrs. Arbuthnot turned away, her face pale. "I thought it was all nonsense. I thought if she were embarrassed, if her words blurred, she would leave quietly. But someone else," Miss Marple said, "wanted her silenced. Not discredited. Someone who had far more to lose if her writing reached the wrong hands." Miss Marple withdrew the folded sheet from her handbag and offered it without a word. Mrs. Arbuthnot took it reluctantly, studying the inked symbols. "That one," Miss Marple said, pointing to a crescent with 3 dots, "appears an illegal journal entry from 1909, and again in a sealed ledger kept by Henry Dodd's father. It isn't just a symbol, it's a signature, a mark of witness." Mrs. Arbuthnot slowly sat down again. "You see," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone had seen this symbol before Fenella ever came here, and when she used it, perhaps by accident, or perhaps with deep knowledge, she summoned more than a memory. She summoned someone's shame." At that moment a figure appeared near the gate. Henry Dodd. He stepped in slowly, his expression unreadable, a folded umbrella in one hand, despite the fair weather. "You brought him?" Mrs. Arbuthnot said, rising again. Miss Marple stood as well. "I didn't, but I suspected he might come. There are moments people must arrive for. Guilt tends to keep appointments." Henry walked over and looked at the paper in his mother's hand. His eyes lingered on the ink, then on Miss Marple. "It was you, wasn't it?" he said quietly. "You guessed." Miss Marple's reply was softer than a breath. "You didn't mean to kill her, only to stop her." Henry looked down. She found the final page. She knew it was part of the codex. She thought it could clear Viola's name, restore her family's truth. "And you," Miss Marple said gently, "knew it would tarnish yours." Henry nodded. "My father forged the record that accused Viola. He did it to protect a patron who feared exposure. Fenella's page, her translation, proved it. If it was ever read by the wrong historian or placed in the royal registry—" "You poisoned the ink," Miss Marple said. "Not with a violent substance, but with a compound that degraded through skin, that wouldn't arouse suspicion at first. You hoped it would disable her, humiliate her, not kill." Henry's voice cracked. "But I saw her that day, laughing, confident. I knew she would submit the page. I added more, just a few drops." Mrs. Arbuthnot covered her mouth. "And when she died," Miss Marple finished, "you pretended to mourn. You destroyed her drafts, but one letter had already been sent." Henry stared at the garden. "I didn't know." "She ensured it," Miss Marple said, "because she knew someone would try to stop her." Silence settled. Barlow arrived minutes later, summoned by a call Miss Marple had made that morning, timed carefully, timed perfectly. He took Henry away without protest. Mrs. Arbuthnot remained on the bench, her face hollow with unspoken ruin. As the garden emptied, Miss Marple stood alone. A breeze turned the pages of a forgotten notebook near the hydrangeas, fluttering softly, like the final breath of a story unwilling to be silenced. And high above the chimneys of St. Cramwell, the sky held its color, not white, not gray, but the faint, persistent violet of ink that refuses to fade. Chapter 11. The Dust That Wouldn't. Settle for days after Henry Dodd's quiet arrest, St. Cramwell moved like a village caught in its own reflection, everything the same, and yet fundamentally altered. The greengrocer opened at his usual hour. The post arrived on time. The vicar gave his Sunday sermon on forgiveness, with hands clasped a little too tightly on the pulpit. And yet no one spoke above a certain volume. No one lingered in the square. Conversations began and then frayed like the edges of a well-thumbed letter. Miss Marple observed it all with a kind of compassionate distance, as though the village were a child recovering from fever, not yet certain whether it was safe to play. Again, she had received only that morning a delicate blue envelope postmarked Edinburgh. Inside was a short note from a Mr. Ainsley at the Royal Collection Registry, confirming that the Codex fragment submitted by Miss Fenella Braithwaite had been catalogued, studied, and preserved. He referred to it as a rare example of encoded matrilineal testimony, and thanked Miss Marple for her efforts in helping ensure its provenance. She folded the letter slowly and placed it among her private papers. Fenella had won, not loudly, not with triumph, but in the only way that mattered. She had not been erased. Mid-morning found Miss Marple walking again, hat tied firmly under her chin, gloves buttoned, a small brown paper parcel in her hand. Her steps took her to Lavender Rise, where Edna Fletcher stood watering a row of asters with military precision. Edna turned as Miss Marple approached and gave a guarded nod. "You've heard," Miss Marple said gently. "Of course." Edna's voice was stiff. "Though the official word is still pending charges. You and I know what that means." Miss Marple offered her the parcel. "A copy," she said, "of Fenella's final letter. It reached Edinburgh safely. They've published a facsimile for academic review." Edna's hand trembled as she took it. I thought you might want to see what she preserved." Edna hesitated. "I didn't like her," she admitted. "She was bold. She disrupted the quiet. But now I find myself hoping she's at peace." "She was never looking for peace," Miss Marple said. "Only the truth." Edna looked down at the parcel, and Miss Marple left her there, standing between her asters and the echo of a story that had nearly disappeared. Back on the high street, the bell above the post office rang as Mary Sims leaned out the door to call after the grocers. "Boy." She spotted Miss Marple and brightened. "Oh, they're talking about putting a plaque up," she said, as Miss Marple approached. "For Fenella. Not at the church, of course, but perhaps near the school. Something simple. Maybe with one of her verses." "She didn't write verse," Miss Marple said quietly. Mary blinked. "Didn't she?" "No," Miss Marple said. "What she wrote wasn't meant to rhyme. It was meant to remind." Mary's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "Still, it seems right to remember her." Miss Marple nodded. "So long. As we remember the right things." As she turned away, Mary called after her. "Do you think she was brave?" Miss Marple paused. "Yes, but bravery doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like ink stubbornly refusing to fade." That evening, just before the sky dimmed into the purple hush of twilight, Miss Marple made one last visit. She climbed the path to the cemetery on the edge of the village, where wild roses tangled through the old iron gate and moss softened every stone. A temporary marker stood at the far end, where the newer graves had begun to settle into place. There was no headstone yet, just a name carved on wood: Fenella Grace Braithwaite. Quietly remembered Miss Marple stood before it, her hands folded. At her waist, a breeze stirred through the yew trees, shaking loose a single curled leaf that landed at her feet. She bent and picked it up. "I think you knew it would end this way," she said quietly, as though to the air itself. "Not violently, perhaps, but inevitably. Some stories refuse to remain unwritten, and some truths demand blood for ink." She placed the leaf gently at the base of the wooden marker and turned back toward the village dot. As she walked, the shadows lengthened but did not seem ominous. The village was returning to itself, not forgetting, not quite healing, but rearranging. And as night fell over St. Cramwell, one light remained glowing in the upper window of a small cottage where Miss Marple sat, book unopened in her lap, listening not for footsteps but for silence, the kind of silence that follows a story well told, the kind that leaves space for memory and ink that will never wash away. Chapter 12. The last mark on the page. It was 1 week after the arrest when the final truth came quietly to Miss Marple, not with a bang or a confession, but with the arrival of a letter she had not expected. The envelope bore no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, practiced, and precise. Inside was a single sheet of pale paper, heavy with texture, the kind used for formal correspondence. No greeting, no closing, only one sentence. She never found the last page, but I did. Below it, drawn in ink darker than midnight, was a symbol. Not one of the old Harwood marks. This one was new, a closed circle, broken at the bottom, with a single downward stroke through its center, clean, final, almost surgical. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time. Her breath held somewhere behind her ribs, because this was not a threat, it was a signature. She did not call Inspector Barlow right away. Instead, she fetched her spectacles and the small magnifying glass she kept for deciphering smudged recipe, cards, and church records. Holding the paper near the window, she studied every angle. The ink had dried unevenly, too quickly. It was not the Braithwaite ink, nor the recreations that had followed. This was something else, modern, manufactured, ordinary, and that was the point. The real final page, Miss Marple now knew, had never been about spiritual symbols or family shame. It had been about protection. Fenella had been trying to hide something in plain sight, not expose a legacy, but shield a truth too dangerous to be named outright. Her symbols, her codex, the poetic ambiguity, it had all been deliberate. A smokescreen, yes, but one with moral purpose. She hadn't been trying to prove the innocence of her ancestor. She had been trying to obscure the guilt of someone else. Miss Marple rose, her limbs moving with a stiffness born of realization. She crossed the room and opened her desk drawer. Inside, carefully pressed and catalogued, were every letter, every scrap, every clue from the case. She removed the first poem Fenella had written marked with her earliest symbols and turned it over. There, in the lower right-hand corner, beneath the edge of the ink blot, was the same circle symbol, faint, almost invisible. As if written not with ink, but with pressure. It hadn't been added. It had always been there. She sat back, breath caught. The murderer hadn't just feared exposure. They had participated in the writing of the final page, and the only person who could have done that, who had both access to Fenella's papers and the intelligence to manipulate the symbolism, was someone who had stayed quietly behind the curtains, never stepping forward, never speaking loudly. Not Henry. He had burned his page out of panic. Not Mrs. Arbuthnot either. Her guilt was born of control, not cleverness. No. It had been Dr. McKinney, the village physician, the only one who'd seen Fenella's body before the others arrived, the one who declared it was likely ink absorption before the labs confirmed it, the one who mentioned the symbols, looked ceremonial, as if casually, but knew exactly what they meant. He hadn't feared the codex itself. He had feared being identified in it. Years ago, he had worked as a young assistant at a private facility near Worley, before his days in general practice, a facility connected to the Harwood estate. There had been whispers of unethical studies, ritual ink, mind mapping, psychosomatic therapy. He had buried that chapter of his life beneath decades of clean practice and village kindness. But Fenella had tracked his name, once mentioned in her great-aunt's notes, and come to St. Cramwell, not just to unlock a manuscript. But to see if the man in it still walked freely. She had played her cards carefully. Too carefully. She'd hoped to protect those around her, and in doing so, underestimated how far someone would go to silence her. Miss Marple placed the symbol side by side with the one and the letter. Identical. She finally called Inspector Barlow. She told him everything quietly, methodically, the way one recites an old, painful recipe. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked only one question. "How certain are you?" And Miss Marple, never one to deal in certainty, simply replied, "Because only the murderer would think the last page had never been found." Barlow left within the hour. Dr. McKinney did not resist. He didn't even ask who had betrayed him. He only asked, softly, whether she had suffered. Barlow said yes. Miss Marple knew he lied. 2 weeks later, a small ceremony was held in the churchyard. The vicar, face lined with regret, led a prayer not just for the dead, but for those who spend their lives chasing the shape of silence. The plaque Mary Sims had hoped for was quietly installed at the schoolhouse garden, not with a poem, but a single phrase, "Ink remembers." So must we. Miss Marple did not attend the gathering. She stayed in her garden, trimming back the ivy, and letting the late autumn light warm the edges of her old stone path. She had written a letter to the registry in Edinburgh, enclosing a single page of fenellas with the hidden mark "Dot," not for proof, not for record, but to close a loop. She would not speak of the case again, because the village, like all good villages, would slowly fold the memory inward into jokes, caution, silence, and someday perhaps forget what the ink had revealed. But Miss Marple would not forget Dot, and neither would the paper.